Betrayal tastes sharpest when served by your own flesh and kin in the hallowed halls of a church. Whispers filled the pews as vows were exchanged, but the bride in white wasn't the woman promised to the groom. She was the jilted sister forced to watch her life get stolen. Dust motes danced in the stained glass sunlight of St. George's, Hanover Square, a cruel, colourful spotlight illuminating the grandest theft of Beatrice Fairchild's life. She stood in the second pew, her spine rigid as a steel rod, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her pale lavender gown that her knuckles were entirely bloodless. A mere 72 hours ago, she was the one meant to walk down that sprawling crimson aisle. She was the one who had spent 6 grueling months managing the chaotic finances of her father, Lord Thomas Fairchild, ensuring there was enough of a dowry to secure a respectable match. She was the one who had accepted the pragmatic, albeit passionless proposal of Edward Linfield, Viscount of Ashbourne. It was an arrangement of mutual benefit. Edward needed the political connections of the Fairchild name, and Beatrice's family desperately needed his wealth to fend off the creditors circling their Mayfair estate like vultures. Yet as the Archbishop droned on with the sacred liturgy, it was not Beatrice standing at the altar. It was her younger sister Josephine. Josephine with her halo of golden curls and perfectly manufactured innocence. Josephine, who was currently swathed in a breathtaking gown of ivory Honiton lace and shimmering silk, a gown that had been meticulously tailored to Beatrice's exact measurements, only to be hastily taken in at the waist and hemmed for the petite, younger Fairchild sister just 2 days prior. The memory of how this nightmare unfolded was a fresh, pulsing wound in Beatrice's mind. It had been a dreary Tuesday evening. Beatrice had gone down to the estate's glass-paned orangery to fetch a misplaced ledger, only to hear the unmistakable sounds of muffled giggles and desperate whispers. She had stepped through the threshold, holding a single candelabra, and the light had fallen directly on her betrothed, his cravat undone, his hands tangled in her sister's hair, pinning Josephine against a potted lemon tree. Beatrice had not screamed. She had not fainted, though the sudden, violent plunge of her stomach had threatened to bring her to her knees. She had simply stood there, an unwanted ghost, haunting her own life, as Edward stumbled backward, his face draining of colour, muttering pathetic, disjointed apologies. Josephine had immediately burst into loud theatrical tears, collapsing onto the stone floor and clutching her face. But the true betrayal had not come from the cheating groom or the treacherous sister. It had come from her own parents. When Beatrice dragged the two of them into her father's study, demanding an immediate end to the engagement and Edward's banishment from their home, Lord Thomas and Lady Violet had exchanged a long, panicked look. "You cannot break the engagement, Beatrice," her mother had whispered, wringing her hands, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "If Lord Ashbourne withdraws his financial support now, we are ruined. The estate will be seized by the end of the month. Then let him marry me, and keep his mistresses in the shadows, as men of his weak constitution often do." Beatrice had replied, her voice eerily calm, despite the roaring in her ears. "But I will not let this humiliation stand." "It is too late for that," her father had interjected, heavily sinking into his leather armchair and rubbing his temples. He looked at Josephine, who was sobbing into a velvet cushion. "Your sister. Josephine came to us yesterday morning. She is compromised, Beatrice. She is with child." The words had struck Beatrice with the force of a physical blow. A child. "We must substitute the bride." Lady Violet had declared, her tone suddenly turning cold, practical, and entirely, utterly ruthless. "We will announce that you have fallen ill, with a sudden, severe bout of melancholia, and that Josephine has stepped in to honour the family's alliance. You will attend the ceremony, Beatrice. You will stand in the pews and you will smile. If you show even a hint of resentment, the ton will sniff out the scandal. Josephine will be ruined, the child will be a bastard, and our family will be thrown into the debtor's prison. You are strong, Beatrice. You have always been the sensible one. You must endure this for the family. You are strong. You must endure." Those words echoed in Beatrice's mind now, as the Archbishop asked if anyone knew a reason why this couple should not be joined in holy matrimony. The silence in the church was heavy, pregnant, with the unspoken gossip of 300 aristocrats. The sudden change of the bride had shocked London high society. While the official story was a mutually agreed-upon shift in affections to spare Beatrice's delicate health, the vicious whisper network of the ton knew better. Beatrice could feel the burning gazes boring into the back of her neck. She could hear the faint, venomous murmurs of Lady Agatha Rutledge in the pew behind her, whispering behind a silk fan. "Cast aside like a damp cloak," Lady Agatha hissed to her companion. Ashbourne clearly tasted the younger fruit and found the elder sister lacking. She must be absolutely mortified. Look at her stiff as a corpse. Beatrice forced her chin up half an inch higher. She would not give them the satisfaction of a tear. She would not shatter. She watched with cold, dead eyes as Edward slipped the heavy gold band, the ring chosen by Beatrice herself, onto Josephine's trembling finger. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Archbishop declared, his voice booming into the vaulted ceiling. Josephine threw her arms around Edward's neck, kissing him with a fervent, inappropriate desperation that made several elderly dowagers gasp and clutch their pearls. Edward looked flushed, victorious, and undeniably relieved. The organ roared to life, a triumphant, deafening melody that signalled the end of the ceremony. The newly minted Viscount and Viscountess of Ashbourne turned to face the congregation. As they began their slow, celebratory walk down the crimson carpet, the guests stood. Beatrice stood with them, her face an unreadable mask of polite indifference. As the couple drew closer to where Beatrice stood in the second row, Josephine's eyes locked onto her older sister's. For a fleeting second, the facade of the innocent, overwhelmed bride slipped. A distinct, unmistakable smirk tugged at the corner of Josephine's glossed lips. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had taken Beatrice's dress, Beatrice's future, Beatrice's title, and Beatrice was forced to stand there and bless the theft. Edward wouldn't even look at her. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the heavy oak doors at the back of the church, his jaw clenched, a coward to the very end. Beatrice felt a dangerous hot prickling behind her eyes. "Hold on," she ordered herself fiercely. "Just 10 more seconds. Let them pass. Then you can disappear." But fate, it seemed, had a completely different script written for Beatrice Fairchild on this dreadful afternoon. Just as Edward and Josephine were about to pass Beatrice's pew, a sudden sharp sound cut through the joyous swelling of the organ music. It was the loud, definitive crack of a silver-tipped walking cane striking the marble floor. The sound was not overwhelmingly loud, but it carried a strange, commanding authority that made the organist falter his fingers, slipping on the keys, turning the triumphant chord into a dissonant, dying whine. The congregation fell into a confused, rippling silence. From the shadowy alcove near the side entrance, a figure emerged, stepping deliberately into the center of the crimson aisle, effectively blocking the path of the bride and groom. A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed through St. George's. Even Beatrice, trapped in her own suffocating bubble of misery, felt her heart stutter in her chest. It was Alexander Carlyle, the 9th Duke of Somerset. He was a man whose reputation preceded him like a dark, rolling thunderhead. At 32, Somerset was arguably the wealthiest and most powerful peer in England, possessing vast tracts of land, controlling shipping empires, and holding the ear of the Prince Regent himself. He was also known as the Iron Duke of Mayfair, not for any military valor, but for his cold, ruthless, and utterly impenetrable demeanor. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features, hair the color of midnight, and eyes like chipped flint. He rarely attended social functions, despised the frivolous gossip of the ton, and had notoriously ruined men for the slightest offences in both business and society. He was certainly not on the guest list for a minor viscount's wedding. Somerset stood tall and imposing in a meticulously tailored coat of pure black, superfine, a stark contrast to the colourful, celebratory attire of the guests. He leaned slightly on his cane, his piercing gaze sweeping over the paralysed crowd, before locking directly onto the bride and groom. "Your Grace." Edward stammered, his face immediately losing its victorious flush, replaced by a pasty, sickly pallor. "What? What an unexpected honour. I was unaware you were in attendance." Somerset did not bow. He did not offer congratulations. He looked at Edward with an expression of such profound boredom and disgust that it bordered on lethal. "Ashbourne." Somerset drawled his voice, a low, resonant baritone that carried effortlessly through the quiet church. "I am not here for you. Do not flatter yourself." Without waiting for Edward to process the insult, the Duke of Somerset turned his back entirely on the newly wedded couple. The disrespect was so blatant, so absolute, that Lady Agatha Rutledge actually whimpered in shock. Somerset took 3 deliberate steps toward the second pew and stopped directly in front of Beatrice. Beatrice stared up at him, her pulse hammering wildly against her ribs. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He smelled of rain-crisp linen and something uniquely masculine and dangerous. "Miss Beatrice Fairchild." Somerset said, his voice entirely different, now softer, yet laced with an undeniable command. "You look as though you are suffocating in this atmosphere of deceit and cheap cologne. I find the air in here exceptionally foul. Will you accompany me outside?" The entire church seemed to stop breathing. Lord Thomas Fairchild, sitting a few feet away, looked as though he might succumb to apoplexy. "Your Grace?" Beatrice whispered, genuinely baffled. She had formerly met the Duke only once 3 years ago, at a crowded ball where they had exchanged perhaps 10 words about the weather. Somerset extended his arm toward her, his black-gloved hand steady and waiting. "A carriage ride, Miss Fairchild, before you shatter your own teeth from clenching your jaw so fiercely." Edward, perhaps emboldened by the presence of his new wife and the hundreds of witnesses, took a foolish step forward. "See here, Somerset, you cannot simply interrupt my wedding procession and accost my sister-in-law." Somerset didn't even turn his head. "Speak again, Ashbourne," he said, his tone lethally quiet, "and I will call in the £30,000 of your gambling debts I quietly purchased from your creditors last week. I will have you thrown in Fleet Prison before you can even consummate this farcical union. Be silent." Edward snapped his mouth shut, so fast his teeth clicked. Josephine let out a tiny squeak of terror, shrinking behind her new husband. Beatrice looked from the terrified, pathetic faces of her sister and her former betrothed to the pale, panicked faces of her parents, and finally up to the imposing, steady figure of the Duke of Somerset. In a world that had demanded she shrink, stay silent, and endure her own destruction, this terrifying, powerful man was holding the door open for her to walk away. Slowly, deliberately, Beatrice unclasped her tightly wound hands. She lifted her chin, meeting Somerset's flinty gaze, and placed her hand on his forearm. His muscles were like granite beneath his sleeve. "I would be delighted to take the air with you, Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice ringing out clear and steady. A ghost of a smirk touched the corner of Somerset's mouth. "Excellent." With perfect unhurried grace, the Duke of Somerset escorted the jilted bride out of the pew. He guided her down the crimson aisle, completely ignoring the whispering, staring aristocrats, forcing the newly wedded Viscount and Viscountess to awkwardly step aside to let them pass. Beatrice did not look back. For the first time in 3 days, the crushing weight on her chest began to lift. They emerged from the heavy oak doors of the church into the crisp Mayfair afternoon. Waiting at the bottom of the steps was an immense, lacquered black carriage bearing the ducal crest, pulled by 4 magnificent jet-black Frisians. A footman immediately snapped to attention, pulling the door open. Somerset handed her inside. As Beatrice settled onto the plush velvet squabs, the Duke climbed in, after her, signalling the driver with a sharp rap of his cane against the roof. The carriage lurched forward, leaving St. George's, Hanover Square, and the ruins of Beatrice's former life far behind. For several blocks, silence reigned inside the carriage. Beatrice stared out the window, her mind spinning, trying to comprehend the sheer madness of the last 10 minutes. "You may exhale, Miss Fairchild," Somerset finally said, leaning back against the cushions, watching her with an intense, calculating gaze. "The performance is over." Beatrice turned to him, her initial shock slowly giving way to a returning tide of pragmatic suspicion. "Why did you do that, Your Grace? You do not know me. And despite your dramatic rescue, men of your station do not create public scandals simply out of the goodness of their hearts." Somerset chuckled a low, rich sound that surprised her. "You are quite right. I possess a rather limited supply of goodness. I rescued you, Miss Fairchild, because I have been observing you, observing me. I know how you have single-handedly managed the Waverley estate's finances, while your father drank away his wits. I know you accepted that imbecile Ashbourne to save your family, and I know through my network exactly what happened in your father's orangery 3 nights ago." Somerset leaned forward the shadows of the carriage, emphasizing the sharp, dangerous angles of his face. "I despise weakness, Miss Fairchild. Ashbourne is weak. Your family is weak. But you stood in that church today, watching your own slaughter, and you did not bend." Beatrice swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure under his piercing scrutiny. "And what does my fortitude matter to the Duke of Somerset? Because," Somerset said smoothly, holding her gaze, "I am in need of a duchess, a woman with a spine of steel and impeccable mind for management, and absolutely no romantic illusions about love. In exchange, I will offer you the protection of my name wealth, beyond your family's wildest comprehension, and the absolute, unmitigated ruin of everyone who has wronged you." He extended his gloved hand toward her again, palm open. "What do you say, Beatrice? Shall we make them regret the day they thought you were expendable?" Rain began to pelt against the lacquered wood of the ducal carriage as it navigated the cobbled streets of Mayfair, washing away the remnants of Beatrice Fairchild's former life. She looked at Alexander Carlyle, the Duke of Somerset, his imposing figure entirely relaxed against the velvet squabs. His proposal was utterly devoid of poetry, lacking any pretense of affection, yet it was the most stabilizing force she had encountered in months. "You offer a business transaction." "Your Grace." Beatrice observed her voice steadying as the shock wore off. "My administrative skills and loyalty in exchange for your title and a highly public retribution." "Precisely," Alexander replied, his sharp eyes missing nothing of her calculating expression. "I require a woman capable of running my northern estates with an iron fist while I manage my shipping interests in London. I have no patience for debutantes who swoon at the sight of a ledger. You, however, saved your father from bankruptcy for 3 consecutive years before Ashbourne came along. You are a brilliant tactician, Beatrice. It is a tragedy your family viewed you merely as collateral." Beatrice felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth bloom in her chest. It was not romance. It was respect, a commodity she had been starved of her entire life. She looked down at her pale lavender gown, the dress she was supposed to wear to her own wedding, and then back to the Duke. "I accept your terms, Alexander," she said, using his Christian name for the first time, a bold move that earned her a genuine wolfish smile from the Duke. "When do we begin?" "Immediately." He tapped his cane against the carriage roof again. "Drive a change, of course. Take us to Lambeth Palace. We have a special license to procure from Archbishop Manners Sutton. 72 hours later, London society was violently shaken from its afternoon tea by news that threatened to tear the very fabric of the ton apart. While Edward and Josephine were suffering through a miserable rain-soaked honeymoon in a draughty cottage in Sussex, having quickly discovered that Edward's accounts at Coutts Bank were mysteriously frozen, Beatrice Fairchild stood in the grand, opulent drawing-room of Somerset House in Grosvenor Square. She wore a gown of deep, striking emerald silk, a stark departure from the pale, submissive colours her mother had always forced upon her. Around her neck rested the legendary Somerset emeralds, heavy and cold against her collarbone, a physical manifestation of her newly acquired power. Beside her stood Alexander, uttering his vows in a voice that commanded the room. There were no gossiping crowds, no deceitful parents, only the magistrate, a few trusted retainers, and the undeniable weight of the bargain they were sealing. When Alexander slipped the heavy platinum band onto her finger, his thumb briefly brushed against her knuckles. "To a prosperous partnership, Your Grace," he murmured, his flinty eyes holding a glint of shared triumph. "To ruining our enemies, Your Grace," Beatrice whispered back. The ruination of Edward Linfield. Viscount of Ashbourne was a masterclass in financial warfare. Alexander had not been bluffing in the church. Over the previous months, knowing Edward's penchant for high-stakes faro, the Duke had quietly purchased every single one of Ashbourne's promissory notes through various shell companies. Edward's entire life was mortgaged to the Duke of Somerset. Upon returning to London, Edward found the doors of his townhouse locked and barred. The creditors acting on Alexander's swift orders had seized the property. Desperate and panicked, Edward dragged a heavily complaining Josephine to the Fairchild estate, demanding Lord Thomas turn over Josephine's promised dowry so they could secure lodgings. It was there in the very study where Beatrice had been told to sacrifice her future that the second blow fell. Lord Thomas, looking aged and haggard, confessed the terrifying truth: there was no dowry. Without Beatrice to meticulously shuffle the accounts and keep the creditors at bay, the Fairchild estate had collapsed in a matter of days. They were ruined. Edward realized with cold, creeping horror that he had thrown away a capable, intelligent woman who could have saved him for a spoiled child who brought nothing but debt and scandal. But the true devastating twist of fate was yet to reveal itself. The climax of the season arrived 4 weeks later at the Duke of Devonshire's masquerade ball. It was an event no member of high society would dare miss, and the tension in the grand ballroom was palpable. When the double doors opened and the majordomo announced, "Their Graces the Duke and Duchess of Somerset," the music seemed to physically stop. Beatrice glided down the grand staircase upon Alexander's arm. She was a vision of absolute authority, draped in midnight blue velvet, a diamond tiara resting upon her intricately braided hair. The same aristocrats who had sneered at her in St. George's Church now scrambled to bow and curtsy, their eyes wide with avarice and fear. Hiding near the refreshment tables, looking dishevelled and frantic, were Edward and Josephine. They had managed to beg an invitation solely on the lingering pity of a distant aunt, but their presence was pathetic. Josephine's golden curls were lank, her dress a recycled gown from the previous season. Unable to control his simmering rage and desperation, Edward broke away from his wife and pushed through the crowd, marching directly toward Beatrice and Alexander. "You orchestrated this," Edward hissed, his face red with wine and fury, pointing a trembling finger at Alexander. "You froze my accounts. You stole my home." Alexander didn't even blink. He looked at Edward as one might look at a stain on a rug. "I merely collected on the debts you willingly accrued, Ashbourne. If you lacked the funds to cover your vices, you should not have sat at the tables. And you—" Edward turned his vitriol to Beatrice, his eyes wild. "You conniving witch. You planned this from the moment you caught me in the orangery. You wanted my ruin. I wanted a marriage of respect, Edward," Beatrice said, her voice carrying effortlessly over the silent, eavesdropping crowd. You chose a path of deceit. I merely allowed you to walk it to its natural conclusion. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing shriek tore through the ballroom. All eyes snapped toward the refreshment tables. Josephine had collapsed onto the polished wooden floor, clutching her stomach, her face chalk white. She was thrashing, crying out in genuine, terrifying agony. The baby Lady Violet screamed, rushing forward from the fringes of the crowd. "Someone fetch a doctor. The Viscount's heir is coming early." A physician attending the ball pushed his way through the chaos, kneeling beside Josephine. The crowd murmured in shock. It was far too early for the child to be born, unless the whispers of a scandalous premarital conception were true. They carried Josephine to a private antechamber, leaving a stunned, breathless silence in the ballroom. Edward stood frozen, his hands raking through his hair. Beatrice felt a sudden, unexpected pang of pity, but Alexander's hand remained firm and steady on the small of her back, grounding her. An hour later, the physician emerged from the antechamber. He looked grim, seeking out Edward among the sea of whispering guests. "Viscount Ashbourne," the doctor said, his voice grave, loud enough for the closest gossips to hear. "Your wife is stable, but I must speak with you privately." "Speak here," Edward demanded, his nerves completely shattered. "Is it my son? Is the child safe?" The doctor hesitated, looking around uncomfortably. "My lord, there is no child." Edward blinked. "What do you mean? A miscarriage?" "No, my lord." The physician clarified, his professional tone cutting through the drama like a scalpel. "I mean, she was never with child to begin with. It was a severe case of hysterical pregnancy, compounded by what appears to be a deliberately tightly laced corset designed to mimic early swelling. She is not and has not been pregnant." A collective gasp echoed through the Duke of Devonshire's ballroom. The lie was exposed. The scandalous pregnancy that had forced the swap of the brides, the ultimate trump card played by Lady Violet and Josephine to trap a wealthy viscount, had been a complete fabrication. Edward looked like he had been struck by lightning. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Lord Thomas and Lady Violet, who were shrinking back against the velvet wallpaper, completely unmasked before the most powerful people in England. Edward had thrown away his reputation, his finances, and his only competent ally for a lie. He was shackled to a fraud, drowning in debt, and utterly isolated. Beatrice stood beside the most powerful man in Mayfair, watching the ashes of her old life settle to the floor. The family that had discarded her was ruined by their own greed. The man who had betrayed her was destroyed by his own weakness. Alexander leaned down his lips, brushing against Beatrice's ear, sending a pleasant shiver down her spine that had absolutely nothing to do with cold weather. "A spectacular conclusion, wouldn't you agree, my Duchess?" Beatrice looked up into the flinty dark eyes of her husband. The contract between them had been born of pragmatism and vengeance, but as she looked at him, she realized she had found the one man in England who truly saw her worth. "It is only the beginning. Alexander." Beatrice smiled, her hand tightening securely in his. "Betrayal may leave a bitter taste, but true vindication is the sweetest nectar of all Beatrice's journey, from a discarded sister to the most powerful Duchess in England, proves that best revenge is living well." If you are captivated by this tale of deception, ruthless ambition, and unexpected romance, do not let the story end here. Please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more epic historical scandal stories.